Okay. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the first of a series of webcasts on the technical details of the Informix 14.10.xC4 release. This is being sponsored by the International Informix Users Group. Unfortunately, all of their board members were tied up with commitments this morning, so I don't have a member of the board to give you, the official hi, thanks for coming to our session type of spiel, and any information or news from the IIUG. As you saw in the announcement, there are a series of 3 webcasts. This first one is going to cover enhancements to the CSDK along with the Informix IHQ graphical administration tool. On August 12th, there will be a session on enhancements to the Informix replication technology, and then on August 26th, the final session, at least that's scheduled so far, is on Java as well as enhancements to how you could administer your Informix environment. This session is being recorded. A replay will be available for download along with the slides from this session. In your registration confirmation package, there was a link down at the very bottom of that 2- or 3-page PDF to the box file or the box folder where the replay information will be located. The replay itself is in a proprietary WebEx format. It requires a special WebEx player to play, but I gave you in that registration confirmation, I did give you the link to where you can find that player, and then you can download it and go through the replay. We do have the HCL developers in this webcast who worked on both the CSDK and IHQ functionality. They are here to answer your questions and hear any feedback you might have. I've invited them to monitor the chat portion of this session. So on your control panel, there is a way of chatting with others. So if you have questions along the way you'd like to ask, feel free to post them into the chat. And if they're monitoring it and responding, they will do so there. Or, as I said, at the end of each major section, we'll pause and open the lines for people to, ask questions. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start with the CSDK. So with Informix 14.10.xC4W1, a new version of the CSDK was released. It is version 4.50.xC4W1 as well. And in the CSDK, there were 4 major new features that were introduced or enhancements that were made. Support for the new .NET Core provider, some enhancements to connection pooling within Odbc, the ability to use client labels now within the Odbc and SetNet 32, as well as some oops, somebody just tried to do something. As well as support for Python within the Smart Trigger functionality. Okay, so let's start with .NET Core. So for years, Informix has provided just a wealth of ways to connect your application to the instance. You can use C and C++, you could use C# and Visual Basic and Tuxedo and Tableau and SQL and Excel and all these different packages, including the Dotnetprovider, which has been in our CSDK and JDBC packages for a long, long time. Microsoft has released a new connectivity framework, which they're calling .NET Core. And in 14.10.xC4 and the CSDK 4.50.xC4, we have now transitioned from the Dotnetprovider to the .NET Core within these products. Well, what's the difference between the Dotnetprovider and the .NET Core? If you go to the Microsoft website, which explains the difference, they say that many of the components between .NET Provider and .NET Core are code compatible. So the function names are the same, the functionality within the functions are the same, but there are some differences. So obviously the Dotnetprovider is the legacy driver, and it's what everybody has been using to date. Microsoft is very explicit with, there's no need to drop what you're doing with Dotnetprovider. It will continue to be supported for years to come, but there will be no new development in the Dotnetprovider. All the new development focus is on .NET Core. If you're using Dotnetprovider, there's a chance you may have additional libraries that you've added onto it from third parties to support different application functionality. That's still going to continue to work. Those libraries may or may not be available for .NET Core. So in that case, you'd want to continue to use the Dotnetprovider. There are some applications which so far do not support .NET Core. For example, there are some Azure services that are not .NET Core supported yet, but they will be in the future. So again, for those services, you'd want to stay with provider. And if the OS that you're using isn't supported by .NET Core. So as you're going to see on the next slide, .NET Core only supports Windows, Mac OS, and Linux-based applications. If you've got a different OS that you're running, for example, Unix, if you're running AIX or you're running HPUX, you're going to want to stay with the Dotnetprovider. Okay. So within our CSDK, we've been supporting the latest version of the Dotnetprovider, and life is good. So .NET Core, again, if your OS is Windows, Linux, or Mac OS, this is where you want to move. If you are going to be using a microservices architecture, for example, if you're going to be using Red Hat OpenShift or Azure, or you want to containerize your Informix environments within Kubernetes or Docker, .NET Core supports all of those platforms. Dotnetprovider only supports Windows containers. So if you're looking to use these type of services, you're going to want to migrate to .NET Core. Since .NET Core is the latest and greatest in their connectivity library, they've made enhancements to scalability and performance and so forth, which they haven't made to the provider. So again, if you want to increase throughput, you want to look at Core. And one of the great things from my perspective that Core provides over just the regular Dotnetprovider is the ability to simultaneously run different versions of .NET Core. Unlike Provider, where you can only install and run one version, with Core, you could have different versions loaded. So if some of your applications are on, let's say, version 1 and other applications need version 2, you can now deploy them over .NET Core and not have to worry for all your applications to be, to support the same version of the driver. Okay. Now, I stole this slide from our developer, and it comes from this Debuggers Hub website. It shows what the different components are that were kind of wrapped together to create the .NET Core. So if this is of interest to you or is of value to you, again, you can get more information on the website listed here. Okay, so with our CSDK 14.10 driver, the 450xC4, we have replaced the .NET platform with .NET Core, and we're using the latest stable version of .NET Core, which is the 3.1.1. Now, there is a version 5 that's out in development and beta testing. Because it's not been certified as stable, we're not using it as yet. The .NET Core is in our Windows and Linux CSDK ports today. In 14, Informix version 14, we stopped supporting the Mac OS operating system, so the Mac OS component is not in the CSDK. Now, the name of the provider has changed. It's the Informix.net.core.dll. It's still located in Informix dir bin. And so this .NET Core was built on top of our full Odbc drivers, so there's full compatibility and support and so forth. And from what development tells me, apparently this .NET Core provider will be available on a NuGet.org website. Now, I have no clue what that is, but you might, and if so, great, it's going to be there sometime in the future. If you want to know what's in the guts of this new .NET Core provider, it was actually built on Windows, and it has been fully tested and certified on Linux, but these are the components, the major components that went into the .NET Core provider. So what we provide is the basic Informix compatibility infrastructure. If you need additional libraries, you will have to go out to those providers and get them and make sure that they are compatible with .NET Core. But as I said, all the existing .NET provider, .NET framework components are supposed to work with .NET Core. It's just you get some additional functionality with .NET Core. Well, what is that additional functionality? You now have support for connection pooling and sizing of the connection pools. So when you spin up your .NET Core pool, you can specify the minimum number of connections you want in the pool as well as the maximum number of connections. So if you want to deploy a pool on an application basis or on a user class basis, you can now limit that class to how much connectivity they have inside of the instance. So you can do a kind of some application fencing, if you will. You also have the ability to look at the number of idle and active connections within that pool. And finally, the other new piece of functionality in .NET Core is the ability to use an Odbc data service name in the connection string itself, which I guess a lot of people have been asking for. All the other .NET functionality that you're used to within the core driver, including data type support and tracing and so forth, is in .NET Core, and it's all fully documented within our documentation as well as the Microsoft documentation. So one of the common questions that people would ask is, well, what do I have to do if I want to use .NET Core and I'm on, the .NET provider? Will it work? And the short answer is yes, though there is a few things you need to do. You're going to have to change the assembly name from IBM.data to Informix to Informix.net.core, and you will have to recompile your application referencing the DLL that's in Informix or bin. But once you do that, all the interfaces and methods and everything else are, as I said at the beginning of this, code compatible, and it should work straight out of the box. So that's the change to .NET Core. Like I said, if you have any questions, you can either hold them until the end of this section or feel free to put them in the chat. Moving on, just general Odbc connection pool enhancements. So with the 14.10.xC2 release and the corresponding CSDK 450.xC2, our Odbc drivers did support native connection pooling. However, with the addition of the min and max pool size functionality from .NET Core, we're now giving you that same support within our own Odbc drivers. So again, if you just use our drivers to set up a pool, you can specify the minimum size and maximum size. If a connection is idle within the pool, the connection will go into an idle state where it will remain for about 10 seconds or so. And if it continues to be idle past that approximate 10-second window, that connection will be closed and disconnected from the instance. Well, how do you set up this connection pooling? And the answer is, it depends. How do you want to set it up? If you're running on Unix or Linux within the odbc.ini file, in the data service name definition block, you can set your minimum and maximum pool size. Within your connection string or within the application, you can use the SQL set connect attribute function, and again set your min and or max size depending on what you'd like to do. Or within the connection string itself, after you define what the data service name is, again you can define your min and max connect size. So that's what's in Odbc connection pooling. Now we go to client label support, and this is now available within the Odbc drivers and setnet32. If you're not familiar with what client labels are, they were introduced in version 14.10.xC1, and it's the ability to assign a unique traceable tag to a session or to operations within the instance. And this label is created using the client label functionality. And we gave you a number of different options on how you can assign a label within the environment. At the operating system level, you can export a label, such as my name is Stephen and I'm using HR app. And as you're going to see in a minute, you'll be able to find that string within the session information inside the instance. If you Java application within the connection string itself, you can define what the label is. Within the application itself, you can use the set environment syntax with client label. You could capture perhaps who the username is. You could say, okay, we're now in function 12, and put that in the connection string, and off it goes. To see these labels, you have a couple of choices. So as you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, I'm in an active session. This just happens to be DB access, but I use the set environment tax, and I set up a label. Then I run a query. That session is still active, and so I say, I wonder if this is session 49. So I do an onstat -g environment for that session ID, and right there at the top you can see my label. So now you can say, aha, this query corresponds to that session, and if they're doing a recursive boil the ocean type SQL, with outer joins, you can go in, slap that user, and say, don't do that again. An easier way to find these labels, rather than looking session by session, is to query the sysmaster sysenv seth table. Now there's 8 components within this table, and the session ID information, or the client label information, is in the 8th component that returns what the client label is. Now in this particular case, it's returning the client label for a specific session, but what you can do is query all of the values out of this sysenv sesh table for value 8. You can then look at the labels. You can trace the label back to the session, and then again you can look at the particular session information, who the user ID is if it's not in the label. Again, slap them upside the head and say, don't do that again. So anyway, that's client labeling. In CSDK 450.xC4, you can now set these labels through your Odbc driver as well as in setnet32. So in the connection string, after you specify what the data service name is, if you want to do that, you can define the label. In the SQL set connection attribute function, you can define the label. Or in the odbc.ini file, which is available in Unix and Linux only, you can put the client label functionality in there as well. And finally, as I said, in setnet32, you can bring up your connectivity configuration parameters. You can assign the label there. Again, this is a screenshot that I stole from development, and then it will be part of the driver, and you can query it, or you can query that session information. So that is client labeling within Odbc. The last thing we're going to talk about is smart trigger support within the Informix Python driver. So smart triggers were introduced in 12.10.xC9 as a way of alerting applications when data changes within your instance environment. So for example, you might have an application that needs to know when a new order has been placed or a value has changed within the instance. Prior to smart triggers, what the application would have to do is periodically ping the instance and say, hey, has anything changed? Has anything changed? Has anything changed? And that put an unacceptable load on the instance. Plus, depending on how wide your ping window was, you could miss a critical window of response. If you were pinging every 10 seconds, but you needed to respond every 2, you might miss that value change. So using Java and JDBC, we now give you the ability to create a smart trigger that monitors whatever change you're looking for within the instance. When that change occurs, it will send an alert to the application, which it can respond to and then do whatever work is needed. And since 12.10.xC9, we've continued to add enhancements to smart triggers. And they're really, really powerful, really nice feature to have. Well, in CSDK 450.xC4W1, we're now enabling smart trigger support within Python applications. And there's now 6 functions that you can use in connection with these within Python applications. You know, starting a session, starting the trigger either within or without of a loop, ending a session, and so forth. And so these are now available to you, kind of. So this functionality, I don't want to say it's pre-beta or it's beta. It's just in quiet mode. And so if this is something of interest to you, you do need to open a tech support case and ask for access to this Python functionality. And development and so forth will get in touch with you to give you that functionality. Okay. And I don't believe it's documented in our documentation, so it's just between you and me, this little group of friends. But I anticipate it will be fully documented in the future. So that is Odbc functionality. Now, what I'm going to do right now is unmute everybody, and if you have questions, let me see how I get there, you are more than welcome to ask them. And if there aren't any, then we'll continue on to the next section. So you are now all unmuted. If there's background noise, like it sounds like there is, please mute yourself. So are there any questions?
This is Jacob. I just sent the question on the chat line. Okay, I'm unfamiliar with the smart triggers at all. I have not tried to use it, but is it available for a high-level language as well, for ESQL for C?
I'm sorry, you were kind of breaking up. What was the question, Jacob?
Okay, so you pointed out that smart triggers is now available for Python, but having never used it, I don't know what it will, and I think it was originally set up for Java. Okay, is there ability to have your smart triggers for ESQL programs?
I will allow development, if they're on the line, to respond to that. My initial reaction is no. It's only been supported with Java, but they may have a better answer than that.
Hey, Colton, this is here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So yes, to answer that, ESQL.
Sorry again.
So unless you're actively speaking, please mute yourself so that the developer can respond. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. So I was saying that ESQL-C does support smart trigger. There are a set of APIs which are well documented, But again, being a C-based API, you may have to follow a few steps to do that. But yes, Smart Trigger could be used with the SQLC application. And just to add, Colton, maybe a couple of days back only, in fact, we supported Smart Trigger in Python in our public repository. So it is indeed available publicly now. Sorry, I could not update you before. So yes, that we can correct now.
Okay. Now I have a follow-up because I don't use ES250 directly, but I'm very heavily using Perl with DBD Informix. Jonathan Leffler is not on the line, I presume. Okay, but do you have any knowledge about that? About allowing it for a Perl application?
No, we don't have yet. I think you're talking about PHP driver, right? PDO driver.
Yeah, DBD : Informix.
Yeah, so we don't support the Smart Trigger for yet. But if you could drop an email, your exact requirement with that, we would certainly look into that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jacob, just send that to me, and I will get that into development. Any other questions on this functionality before on the ODBC section before we continue on? Okay, thank you very much. So let me mute you all. Okay, you're all on mute. And we continue. Okay, so now we get to Informix HQ 1.2. And there is a lot of really good functionality in here. Some of it is documented. At least some of what I'm going to show you today is documented. Some of it is not. But there are also some, how can I put this, opportunities for improvement or functional issues that you need to be aware of, and the development team for IHQ is very aware of what these are. I am going to show them to you just so you know. But there are a couple of things that, couple of rough edges, let's just say. So let's go ahead and keep going. So what do we have in IHQ 1.2? There's a new start and stop script, which I don't think is documented. If it is, it's been fairly recent. There's support for connection manager functionality, custom dashboards, some great stuff in the Schema Manager, and then the ability to create your own custom reports, or custom system reports. You know, as the IHQ development team said back when 1.0 was released, you know, we're going to be adding more functionality. Some of it's going to be compatible with what you had in ODE. In other cases, we're going in different directions. And so you're seeing some new stuff here, as well as some ODE-type functionality that's being added to IHQ. So let's go ahead and get started. So there are some new start and stop scripts for the IHQ server and the IHQ agents. Like I said, I'm not sure whether these are documented or not, but if they're not, you get to see them first here. In the past, prior to version 1.2, the only way that you could start the either the server or the agent processes was through the Java command line. To stop them, you had to query in the operating system, search for Java, find those processes, and do a kill -9 on them. It wasn't the most graceful way of handling it. Well, starting in IHQ 1.2 now, there's a new shell script that makes starting and stopping the agent and server processes much more easy, graceful, and really nice to use. Called Informix HQ.shell or .bat if you're a Windows user. This script is in the IHQ subdirectory, and it gives you the ability to fork the IHQ server or an IHQ agent with a service name, as well as assign parameters to that service. Now, the service name is what you're going to use to stop these processes when you're done. Now, because you're starting and stopping with these services, it does not mean you can skip configuring the .properties file. You're still going to need to do that, you know, set up what the master ID password is for the server and the port number and the other parameters for the agents and so forth. This is just a more graceful way, as I said, to start and stop them. There is a help option to the command. So if you do an ihq.shell help, you can see what the command strings are, or the command parameters are. And you know, they're not always consistent. Some of the parameters require the parameter name and an equal sign. Some of the parameters don't. I'm sure there must have been some reason why they're not consistent and either do it all one way or all the other, but that's the way it is today. What is particularly, what you need to pay attention to right off the bat is the encoding option for the server and the agent. The default encoding locale is UTF-8. Now, for many people, they don't run UTF-8. They use, let's say, EN_US 819. So you're going to need to specify what the encoding value is, or the locale value is, for your server and your agents in order for IHQ to work with your instances. So I bring that out. I call that out for you to be aware of. To start a service, for example, I want to start the IHQ server. I can go into the subdirectory. I run ihq.shell start server. I give it a service name, and because I'm not using UTF-8 as my locale, I put in the encoding parameter that I want, hit return, and the process starts. I can go out now into my OS, do a ps-ef grep for that service name, and there it is, okay? So that's how you would start it. Starting the IHQ agents is very similar. Instead of using start server, you're going to use start agent. However, this brings up an interesting functional nuance to the start and stop script, something that you need to be aware of. If you are using just the direct command line, for example, you see here at the bottom, java-jar, what the jar file is, you can pass in any name you want for the properties file. It does not matter. You could call it my new properties, and off it would go. The start and stop scripts for this new functionality are very, very, very sensitive to the name. It must have the .properties suffix on it. It can't be .prop, it can't be .property, it can't be, in this case, properties_1. It must be .properties. So in my case, I had an instance where I had 7 active instances. And when I started IHQ server and IHQ agent, I used a shell script, and these were the properties files for each of the different agents. I'd run these Java commands, and it would go off and run. In order to use the start and stop scripts now, what I need to do is rename these properties files such that, as you can see on the bottom, the properties names end in .properties, and now I can go out and run the start and stop script with these names and pass it in. So, for example, ihq.shell start agent, what the service name is, what the encoding value is, and because I've got 7 instances with 7 agents, I have to give it the agent properties file, and there it is. So it starts, and again, I can go in and do a ps-ef for the agent name, and you can see it within the instance. Now, to stop a server or an agent service, you simply use the stop agent and pass in the service name. So if I want to stop that particular agent, I say ihq.shell stop, the service name, and as you can see in the ps-ef, that service is now gone, that process is gone. Which brings up another interesting functional nuance to the start and stop scripts. And again, development is well aware of this, and I'm assuming it's going to fix that in the next release. When you run the stop script, it does not validate whether that service name actually exists. So if you have a typo in the name, you're going to get a terminated response as if that service is actually gone, when in fact it's not. So, and I actually found this the hard way. Again, I've got this instance environment with 7 instances. I have a shell script that starts all the instances, a shell script that starts all the IHQ functionality. So I booted the instance one day, started the instances, and then by mistake I ran the stop script first. It was just a stupid typo on my part, and I saw, wait, they're all terminated. How can they be terminated? They haven't been started yet. So just be aware, when you run this, you do need to make sure that you don't have a typo. Like I said, development is aware of this. I'm assuming it will be fixed in the future. So that's the start and stop script. Like I said, it's nice to have. It's a nice improvement. It may or may not be documented, so there you go. Now then, Connection Manager functionality. Again, another nice piece. Again, the beginning of some OAT functionality. However, there are a number of areas for improvement and functionality enhancements and so forth with this. One of which I initially thought was a bug and needed to be corrected. I've since changed my mind on this and realized it's the right design for what they're doing, and I'll explain why that is in just a second. So you understand, all the examples that I'm going to be using for this portion of the presentation are from a 4-node HA cluster. So you can see I have a primary instance, I have a shared disk secondary, an HDR secondary, and an RS secondary. One of them is, all of them are enabled for updatable secondary save 1, and at this particular moment within the cluster, I do not have any Connection Manager functionality running. So what I did is I went to the command line like I normally do, ran the Connection Manager start and stop commands. I configured my Connection Manager configuration files. So I had 2 different Connection Manager agents running. Each agent had different SLAs within them. Okay. So once that was started, I went into IHQ and looked at the functionality that's available there as far as Connection Manager is concerned. So in this 1.2 release, you can now see your list of active agents. You can administer the SLAs. You can modify the failover control sequence. You can modify which SLA is the active arbitrator and so forth. And a lot of this is driven by a new sensor that's been added to IHQ for Connection Manager functionality. So you can add this sensor to your environment by going into the list of all the sensors, clicking on it, and firing it off. And this SLA connections sensor works for all SLAs, whether it's within an HA cluster, an ER cluster, or a grid cluster. Okay. So I fired off the SLA, and then I went into IHQ, and I clicked on the instance primary and expected to see 2 active Connection Managers, but there's only 1 showing up. What is happening here is it is showing just the active arbitrator, that there is a Connection Manager active, which is the arbitrator. It's not showing that there are 2 different agents out there. And again, this is something that's been raised with development, because once you click on the primary, you should be able to see both. Now then, if you click on any of the other instances, so for example, if I were to click on inst2 or inst3, all you're going to get is information on that instance itself, or about that instance. So the only way you can get high-level overview of your Connection Manager information is to click on the cluster primary in an HA cluster. Okay. However, there is a new option underneath the Replication tab called Connection Manager, and there you will see both Connection Manager agents. So there's CMSM1, which is the active arbitrator, and CMSM2. You can see the connection unit name, so there's HA1 and HA2, and within each of those different units are different SLAs. And you can dive down and look inside each one of those unit names and get more information. Okay. So for example, I'm diving down inside the HA1 unit name, and you can see that for this Connection Manager agent, I can change the failover time, whether I want to change it from being the failover arbitrator or not, what the failover sequence is, whether, what its priority is and everything else. And you can see some information about the SLAs within that connection unit. Now, the fact that the policy is blank, workers blank, ports blank, and so forth should be a clue that there are some opportunities for improvement here with the Connection Manager functionality, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But before I talk about any of that, I need to bring three things to your attention. The first is, as I thought initially a bug, now I'm thinking that it is correct functionality. And that is that if you go in and use the IHQ to administer your SLAs or your connection managers, it will not modify your SQL host file. Now, as you know, SLAs kind of act as pseudo instances. Once you define an SLA in a command line session, for example, you can say database name at SLA name, and you will connect to your instance, through whatever the SLA routing protocol is. Now, in order for that to work and for applications to be able to use an SLA, there must be an entry in the SQL host file. Well, the Connection Manager does not modify SQL hosts. It does not modify it when you add an SLA. It does not modify it when you delete an SLA. It does not verify or validate that an SQL host entry exists for the SLA that, the SLA that you're trying to modify. So the initial takeaway from this is you can add or drop, well, it's more important for add. You can add an SLA within the connection or within IHQ, but nobody's going to be able to use it because the SQL host entries haven't been made. Now, as I said, I initially thought this was a bug and something that needed to be corrected. As I've thought about it over time, I've realized, no, this is really the right way to do it. And the reason behind that is because the IHQ server and the IHQ agents can be deployed in either what I call on-world mode or off-world mode. And by that I mean the agent or the server can be co-resident on a machine that has an instance, or they can be on different machines, not even associated with Informix. Well, for them to be able to modify the SQL host file, if they're deployed in off-world mode, that means that they need to go out and do a bunch of remote access commands to gain access to that server or servers and make changes to the flat file. If you're running in a Windows environment, that means that IHQ would have to be able to go out and touch each one of those Windows machines and make changes within, or their client machines, I should say, and make changes to their, SetNet 32 environments or their other connectivity files. And that's just not feasible. It's not reasonable to expect the tool to do that. So the fact that you can add and drop them, I think, is great, but the takeaway is you still must manage the SQL host file yourself. And as I said, I think that's the right thing to do. So just be aware that this is what happens. Number two is validation of entries within SQL hosts. So you can see in this example down at the bottom, I have 3 SLAs that have been defined. There's one called OLTP, catalog, and reports. And in their definitions, you can see in the 4th file that I am using a port alias rather than an explicit port number. And that port alias corresponds to an entry in Etsy services where I say OLTP, TCP is actually using port 60,002. Okay, great. When you go in to add an SLA through IHQ, it will not validate that the SLA name is in SQL host. It will also not validate that the service number or the service alias exists in SQL hosts. Okay, so what that means is, again, you can add an SLA within IHQ, and nobody will know that it's there. You are going to have to go out and make sure that all the SQL host entries are up to date. It also means that, again, if you have a typo, yes, the entry is there in SQL hosts, but when you enter it in IHQ, you transpose two numbers or you transpose two letters. With this current release, it's not validating that information. So again, you may have done the SQL host work, but you blow it on the data entry part, it's not going to be an active SLA that people can use. So again, just be aware that that's happening. Okay. Finally, the third thing, which is good news, if you will, is that when you do make a successful, or when you make a change within IHQ to the connection managers, the connection manager configuration files are updated. So your current configuration file will be renamed to .temp, and the newly updated configuration file is there. Now, there's only one level of change maintained, so you will only get one .temp file. And it's also important to mention that this only affects the local definition file for the agent. Again, if you're deployed in off-world mode, we're not going to be able to update the configuration file unless the on-CMSM utility does it. And it's only going to be able to define the one file where the agent was actually started from. So just be aware of those three nuances. Okay. So let's go on now. So I have an SLA out there. It's called catalog. I now want to administer it within IHQ, so I click the modify button. IHQ knows that the SLA is there, but it doesn't know anything about the SLA. So for example, it doesn't know what the service port number is, it doesn't know the number of workers, it doesn't know what instances are participating in the SLA. Now in this particular screenshot, I've added some of the data into it. But it's not really functional out of the box to make changes to the SLA. You really are going to have to, what you'd have to do is go to the Connection Manager configuration file, grab all that information, populate it into IHQ. Well, if you're going to go to the Connection Manager configuration file, just make the change there and restart the Connection Manager. But, again, hopefully that's something that can be changed in the future so that it does understand what the properties for the SLA are. But out of the box today, it's not quite finished. If you want to drop an SLA, again, just click on the trash can and it goes away. You are going to have to make the SQL host changes around your cluster environment or your instance, your application environment, so they understand that that SLA is no longer active, and it will make changes to the Connection Manager configuration file for you. If you want to add a new SLA, so again, the best practice is to make the SLA entry in SQL host. So you can see at the top here, I have a test SLA entry in my SQL host file, and in this particular case, I need to move this screen here so I can see it. Yes, I'm using the explicit port number. So now I can go in and hit the Create SLA button, put in the name. For the service, you have the option of using either the port number or the service alias. Either one you want to use. You can set up the number of workers and whether it's a redirect or a proxy mode, what instances you want. Click Save, and again, it will go off and your SLA will be active, as you can see right here. So in this top window here, you can see now within the IHQ display, here's my test SLA. If I do an onset -G CMSM, again, it's now an active SLA that's out there and people can use. And if I look at the configuration file for that agent, there is now the test SLA entry within the configuration file. So that's the connection manager functionality. Okay, nice to have. Kudos to the development team. Just a few things that we need to get finished. Okay. Custom dashboards. Okay, when you sign into IHQ and you click on an instance, you have your default dashboard. A lot of this is what's displayed from your sensors. There are some default sensors and so forth that are enabled within the environment. But suppose you have an environment with multiple IHQ servers running. Perhaps you have a server running on the East Coast and another server on the West Coast. They each have their own set of agents that are connecting to all your instances. Just in case the box where your server is running goes down, you have a backup server. Well, it would be nice to have the look and feel from one IHQ server environment also be available on the other IHQ server environment. And you can do that with the ability to create a custom dashboard, export it, and then import it into the other server. So that's now available to you. You now have the ability to use a graph within a custom query and to vary how you want to visualize some of your display results. You can now use bar or par charts as well as tabular results in your answers. So let's look at how this works. So in my environment, I don't have a custom dashboard, so I click on the button that says Add a Dashboard. I can then go in and select panels or groups of functionality that I want to see. So in my case, I want to look at the SLA connections through either all of the SLAs or through a particular SLA, and I can add it to the dashboard. And I can hit the little Save button, and it's now been added to this particular dashboard. If I want to add another component to this dashboard, perhaps from a different instance, I can add that as well. So in this particular case, I'm looking at some logical log information from instance 1, as well as SLA connections from instance 4. If I want, I can vary what the output is or what the output looks like. Oh wait, I haven't gotten there yet. Hold on just a second. If you want to have a custom query, you can add the query within the data sources for that panel, and you can put whatever your query is you want to see. Within the panel, like I said, you can change the visualization of the answer. So again, this is my logical log apply rate, so I can look at it as a bar graph. I can look at it as a pie chart, which is really useful for this particular type of data, or I can look at it in a tabular form, however you want to see it. So here's my new dashboard. All right. I can then go in, give the dashboard a name by clicking on the little pencil icon and save it. And now this dashboard, is called Test Dashboard, and it shows up again under the instance environment for that particular instance. I can click on it and say Export, and a JSON file is created and created in the Downloads directory for the Informix user ID. I can take that JSON file. I can go to my other Informix server environment, say I want to import the dashboard, point it to where the JSON file lives, and now that dashboard is available within that other server. Okay? So again, nice thing to have. Really easy to use, gives you the ability to have consistency if you have multiple IHQ servers across your environment. Okay. I know we're getting to the top of the hour. There's just one or two more things I want to cover, and then we'll open it up for questions. Schema Manager. Oh, this is great. There are so many good things here in Schema Manager. Prior to version 1.2, there was basically no information available within the Schema Manager. You could click and see there was a database. You could click on a table and see that the table existed, and that was about it. In 1.2, there is just a slew of information, and it's all great stuff. So let me quickly run through what some of this is. At a database level now, so when you select a database, you can see your options here. You can get information about it. You can look at the stored procedures and functions, user-defined types, privileges, database, data blade modules, casts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, if I select stored procedures and functions, you can see all the system functions that are in there, as well as any user-defined functions that you might have created. You can click on one of the function names and you can get more details on it. If you click on the user-defined data types, again, you get your built-in types. Hold on. As well as any user-defined type. So I created an address underscore T type, and that's showing up as well. If you want to look at privileges, who's got DBA and who has connect privileges. If you want to look at data blade modules that are active within that database, it's all available at the database level. Now, if you click on a table within the database, you get all of these options that are available at a table level. So where was the table created, and the privileges and statistics and triggers and all that sort of good stuff. So you can see what the schema of the table is in graphical format. You can look at the statistics for the table. For example, how much data change has occurred within the table. That's all available to you. I apologize for the phone ringing in the background. If you have extended or user-defined types, they will show up within the table or within the display. So in this particular table, I have two columns using built-in types and then a BSON column or a BSON data type in the third column. If you're using time series, for example, you can see the time series columns within the table. If your table has hidden columns, for example, you've enabled vert calls for updatable secondaries, or you've entered CR calls for timestamp conflict resolution within enterprise replication, you'll see those columns as well, and the fact that they are hidden because they are marked with an X within the schema display. You can add and drop indexes on these tables, and you can create any type of index on the table you want. It can be unique or clustered, forest of trees, XML, whatever type of index you want. And we now get the View SQL toggle, which was always my favorite component of OAT. The ability to point and click and get things done for new administrators, for example, who didn't know how to work with Informix. We're now starting to see the command line commands that are associated with those point and click operations so they can learn how things are really supposed to be done. Anyway, you can also enable or disable indexes. So if you're going to do some large data manipulation with the table, again, you can enable or disable the indexes during that administrative work. Okay. Now then, the little three-dot button beside the database selector gives you the ability to create a new database, to drop a database, or to create the stores database, if you will, the demo database functionality. So if you click on create a demo database, you can give it the name, you can tell us, you can indicate which DB space you want it in, whether it's logged or unlogged, and whether or not you want the time series tables created and the time series types registered. Unlike the command line option, you do not get the ability to download the scripts, but I don't know anybody who used those anyway, so you're not missing any functionality there. When you create a regular database, again, you can put in what the database name is, where you want it created. You can search for the locale for that particular database, and there, because I've got the full GLS package loaded, every single locale is available to you. You can specify whether the database is logged or not logged, whether or not it's case sensitive. Again, great functionality, easy to use. And that is the Schema Manager portion. And the final part is customized system reports. So again, when you log in and you select, you click on an agent and you click on the agent data, you get kind of a dashboard of information and a series of reports based, graphical reports based on the sensor information. However, we also have a list of built-in system reports. And again, this was always my favorite part of OAT, beside the toggle SQL button, were things like show me the SQL statements with the highest I/O or the slowest SQL statements. And I'd always go in and tell people these are the reports you want to look at. If you want to make your environment faster, look at the answers to these 3 or 4 custom reports, and you'll do yourself a world of good. Well, if you want to create your own report, you can now do it and add it to the system reports functionality. It does require that you have IHQ Admin Rights. Now, by and large, most people, when you configure IHQ, are only given end-user privileges. When you add a user, you can say, okay, they have access to these instances, they can read, they can administer the instance. They can administer the instance. There's also a toggle when you add an end user whether or not they can administer IHQ itself. Typically, I don't recommend you give that to end users, but to create a custom report, you do need that level of functionality. So you either need to log in as the IHQ admin itself or with an ID that's been given IHQ admin functionality. So again, logged in this particular case is IHQ admin. I go to the system settings, and I look at report management, and you can see that no custom reports have been created. So I click on the Create Report button, and I go ahead and enter the query that I want to use, what instance I want it to run against, the database, and so forth. And you can click a Run button to get a preview of what that report is going to generate, so you can see whether or not it's working the way you anticipated. You can go in and rename the column headers for the report. So for example, if you want the column name time to be something else in the report, you can change that from this screen. There is a area of improvement here in this one particular part of IHQ. You only get 4 or 5 columns before some formatting errors occur. Again, development is aware of this and they're working on it. You give the report a name and a description and what category you want it to fall in. The report itself is stored as a JSON file. So if you want to look at the components of the JSON file itself, you can see what it looks like. And now, when I go to my custom reports, you can see I now have a test report there. I can click on it, run it, and there's the results from my custom report. So again, nice piece of functionality to have. And that's everything that I'm going to cover today. Now, before I unlock everybody's phones and allow you to ask questions, in your registration confirmation, there was a link to where the replay information is, or I should say will be. I'll be putting these slides and the replay out there later today. You're more than welcome to download and share them. As I mentioned, we have 2 more sessions scheduled. The login credentials are going to be exactly the same for those other 2 sessions as they are for this one. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to unlock everybody's phone. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them. Again, if you don't, I would ask that you mute your phone so we don't get feedback or background noise. So the lines are now.
Y dióxido realmente ayudó, y a mí también me ayudó. O si la señora que le fue bien con la medicina y fue saliendo.
Can people please mute themselves? Okay, I heard someone trying to ask a question. Go ahead. any questions?
Exactamente, exacto. No, por eso, ahí digo, hermano, no sé, por ahí podemos ir aumentando, poniendo platita a su cuenta, por ahí ver este tema y por ahí tendremos que comprarnos el tema del oxigenador, ¿no? No sé, hermano, porque he visto ahí.
It doesn't sound like there are any. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.